I'm going to talk about analogical reasoning and metaphor processing in autism. And I should say I've conducted this work together with Dusan Stamenkovic and Keith Holyoke and Jane Hamilton. And I think Dusan and Keith might be here today as well, so they might have some comments on what I'm presenting later today. I will start by introducing analogical reasoning and metaphor processing. And I will also talk about the IQ, or the typical IQ profile in autism. So what are the typical strengths and weaknesses of autistic people? And also the concept of weak central coherence, which you might not be familiar with if you are not really into the autism literature. Then I will also present the results of two recently published papers. The first one is a meta-analysis of analogical reasoning in autism, which was published as a book chapter. And then a meta-analysis of metaphor processing in autism, which was published as a journal paper in developmental science. And the final study is a more well, it's not really a very recent study, but it's a study that we just submitted for publication, where we try to integrate these two lines of work and looked at both verbal analogical reasoning and metaphor processing in autism and also in typical development. Okay, so probably most of you know much more about analogical reasoning than me, because as you could see from the introduction from Margarita, I have quite a broad research interest, and analogical reasoning is just one topic that I sometimes work on. But I think what you should consider is that analogical reasoning relies on kind of making relations between different entities and mapping between different concepts, and sometimes you have a more familiar source analogy and you have a more unfamiliar target analogy. And analogical reasoning can also be used for problem solving or to explain things. For example, you could use the analogy between flowing water and electricity. So you can think about electric current as the rate of how quickly the water flows through a pipe, for example, or resistors are kind of similar to a narrow pipe, which yeah, so you can draw similarities between different entities, and sometimes it can help people to understand some novel, unfamiliar concepts better. And I think what is also interesting is that analogical reasoning is often investigated in a visual format, although you can also look at verbal analogies, and it's also quite often used in conversational, everyday situations. And then I think you are all very familiar with Raven's progressive matrices. The only thing I really want to highlight about this is that although it relies on some kind of analogical reasoning, it's also a very typical measure of fluid intelligence. So we often think about it not really as an analogical reasoning task, but a more general domain general reasoning skill. And so what is metaphor processing? I guess it's similar to analogical reasoning in the sense that it relies on creating links between concepts or conceptual domains which are similar in some respect. Also, it requires the activation of semantic or conceptual information, and also quite often relies on contextual processing. So in the case of metaphor processing, it's very important that maybe So you could interpret a statement in a literal way, but often the context gives you a cue to understand that actually you should think about the figural meaning of a statement. And very often we come across metaphors in a verbal format, but we can also, there are also visual metaphors, like the example that I put on this slide, and also metaphors can be multimodal, for example, as you might see them in films, and they often have a certain aesthetic property, and they don't necessarily want to explain something. It's often more about conveying a feeling or some kind of emotion, and they can have multiple layers and maybe slightly different meaning to different people. Okay, and I just put here some examples, like the falling snowflakes are dancers, or the children were flowers grown in concrete gardens. So sometimes you get more kind of longer, more extended metaphors. Okay, so why am I talking about analogical reasoning and metaphor processing in the same talk? Well, obviously there are some similarities between analogy and metaphor processing, and basically because they both rely on kind of creating links, making or exploiting similarities between different entities. And there are also some theories which believe that metaphor comprehension actually relies on analogical reasoning. There's a stronger version of this theory, which was first kind of developed or proposed by Aristotle, and then more recently have been built on by some researchers. And there's also a more limited version of this idea, which is called the carrier of metaphor hypothesis, which is basically stating that when you hear a really novel, unknown metaphor, then you might rely on analogical reasoning to process it. But as you become more familiar with an idea, with a metaphor, or if you are processing a conventionalized metaphor, then you don't really rely on analogical reasoning anymore. But also there are other views of metaphor which think about it as a linguistic phenomenon, which mostly relies on semantic integration, and in this view it's more similar to just the typical language processes, and relies more on crystallized intelligence rather than fluid intelligence. And also we should note that if you look at the neural basis of analogical reasoning and metaphor processing, you find that the underlying systems are only partially overlapping. So if you look at brain activation patterns in the case of analogies and metaphors, you find only a partial overlap. So there's little evidence that they would rely on very much the same processes. Okay, so now a little bit about autistic cognition. So the weak central coherence theory was quite a dominant theory of autistic cognition, starting from I think in 1981 was the first time when it was proposed, and then it was developed and had different versions, but it was still quite dominant in the early 2000s. So quite an influential theory of autistic cognition. And so the idea was that autistic people attend to details in their environment, and they cannot really experience something as a whole without processing all the different details, all the constituent parts. And so this is a classic experiment with autistic people. So you are probably familiar with the Vexar intelligence test and the block design subtest, which is about looking at a pattern, a visual pattern like this, and you get blocks which have different sides, white, red and white parts, and your task is to try to put together, to recreate this pattern from the blocks as quickly as you can. And what the study found was that typically developing people, if they have to do this task, they are much faster if the design is pre-segmented. So it really helps them to see where are the little parts, where should the little blocks go in the pattern. So in this pattern here. But for autistic people, it didn't make any difference. And so the argument was that they already saw this pattern as pre-segmented. They didn't focus on the overall pattern within this image. Also, there was another very interesting study. We looked at the level and nature of autistic intelligence. And so what you see in these graphs is performance of autistic children and adults on different types of intelligence measures. So you see performance of the same or of the same group of participants on verbal and performance intelligence measure. So based on the Vexar intelligence scale, their full scale, in the IQ based on the Vexar scale, and Raven's matrices IQ. And so if you look at the results from typically developing people, you can see that whatever way you measure their level of intelligence, you get a very similar IQ score, which is what you would expect. But if you give the same intelligence test to autistic people, what you might find is that on the Vexar intelligence scale, they might perform way below the level that they perform on Raven's matrices. So the idea, this paper proposed that maybe autistic intelligence is underestimated when we rely on Vexar intelligence test-based IQs, but another possibility is that they have a real strength in analogical reasoning or a real strength in fluid intelligence. So there was this big discrepancy between their intelligence as measured with these two methods. And you can see that even within the Vexar scale, they have some particular strengths, for example, in the block design task that I presented before, and some typical weaknesses, for example, in verbal comprehension. And so, how does the weak central coherence account relates to language in autism? So again, I present some classic, the results of some classic studies which were conducted in the 1990s. So one example is participants had to read homophones, so words which have different pronunciations. So for example, a tear in the eye and a tear in a fabric. And what they found was that in the case of the autistic participants, they often just went with the more familiar pronunciation. So for example, they pronounced it as tear in both cases. They didn't really care about the context in which the word was presented. They were just relying on which was the most frequent pronunciation. So they interpreted this as autistic people not striving for meaning, or that they didn't use the context to disambiguate the meaning of these expressions. And so how it relates to figurative language processing in autism, as I said earlier, contextual clues are really important in this case, and you have to kind of suppress the literal interpretation of these expressions. So it's important that you take into account the context and come up with the appropriate interpretation of these expressions. And so based on this early research, figurative language impairments were part of the official ESD diagnostic criteria until quite recently. So until I think 2013 was when the new DSM, the statistical manual, was published. And now so now the new suggestion is that maybe this is more related to language impairments in autism, this kind of problem, and not really a core characteristic of autistic cognition. Okay, so I'm going to present the results of these two systematic reviews where we looked at analogical reasoning and we looked at metaphor processing in autism. And so what was the aim of these reviews? So of course, we wanted to give an overview of the existing literature and also try to identify some gaps in our current knowledge. And also because there are some controversies in these literature. So whether analogical reasoning is really a strength of autistic people, but some people would argue that maybe they might struggle with this, at least in some contexts, because of this focus on details rather than the bigger picture. And the same for metaphor processing. So whether impairments in metaphor processing are really so widespread in autism as it was hypothesized some time ago. Also, we were interested in whether there might be some developmental delays in these skills, and also whether the results depend on how you match your participants. So, for example, whether matching them on Wechsler IQ, for example, or matching them on verbal intelligence would moderate the group differences. Okay, so just to explain, because you're not so familiar with maybe with result or research with autistic participants, so apart from that, we wanted to look at original research studies, which presented some new data. Also, we wanted to make sure that participants were diagnosed with autistic spectrum disorder by experienced clinicians, because there are also some studies which present results from, for example, measuring autistic traits in typically developing people, which is really not the same as looking at real autistic people. Also, it was very important that, of course, we needed a typically developing comparison group, but they had to be well matched to the autistic group, not only on chronological age, which is kind of important so that you match for kind of knowledge of like general knowledge and maybe level of education and so on, but also that they were matched on either full scale or verbal IQ, because we know that intelligence is really important for analogical reasoning performance, and verbal ability is very important for metaphor processing. And just a final point, that we also included studies from the Gray literature, which is, for example, dissertations, conference proceedings, or conference abstracts. And we did that to try to avoid publication bias, because quite often studies which don't find a significant difference or a significant result, they remain unpublished, which could, of course, distort the results of meta-analyses. And so just to give you an idea of the, how much work was put into looking at the literature. So basically, we identified for the analogy review. So we looked for papers which combined some reference to autism with either analogical reasoning or performance on Raven's matrices. So we identified almost 2,000 papers with these criteria, but then a lot of these were excluded after we screened the titles and abstracts, and 61 papers were included at the full text stage, where we actually checked the details in the papers. And in the end, I guess a bit disappointingly, we were only able to include 12 studies in the quantitative synthesis, which was still which included more than 300 ASD and TD typically developing participants. And so we had quite a similar experience with the metaphor review. So we identified here a little bit less papers, so 630 papers, 49 papers reached the full text stage, and then we could include 14 papers in the final quantitative synthesis, which again meant a bit more than 300 participants for both groups. Okay, so these are the results for the analogy meta-analysis. So I just want to say a few words about forest plots. So, and also, so we used Hedges G as the effect size statistic, which is really similar to Cohen's D. So it's kind of the same interpretation. The only difference is that it corrects for biases in smaller samples. So it's a little bit, it's considered a bit more precise. Okay, so basically each, within the graph, each little box represents a single study or a separate study. You also see the error bars or confidence intervals for these for the effect sizes. And if you see a larger square, larger box, that means a larger study with more participants. And in this graph, you also see that I used hollow squares to represent pictorial analogies, and the black or full squares represent performance on Raven's matrices. And so what you should notice is that effect sizes range quite widely. So starting from -1, which means that the control group performed about 1 standard deviation better on the analogy task than the autistic group. And on the other end, also in some studies, there was 1 standard deviation advantage for the autistic participants. But overall, the average effect size was 0. So there was no difference in analogical reasoning in general between the two groups. So because you see this clear separation between studies that looked at pictorial analogies and studies that used Raven's matrices, we also ran a separate analysis just including studies with Raven's matrices. And you see that in this case, there's actually some advantage for the autistic participants. So the effect size, yeah. So the summary effect size is this this shape at the bottom, and you can see that it doesn't cross the 0 line. So it means that it's significantly different from 0. And it's kind of a small effect size. Yeah, it's 0.37 for this effect. Okay, so basically, autistic people have a small advantage in performance on Raven's matrices when they are compared to IQ and age-matched, typically developing participants. And also, what we found in this second or separate meta-analysis for including just Raven's matrices results, that this was moderated by participants' level of intelligence. So this plot here presents the results of this additional meta regression. So again, I explain how you should interpret this result. So you can see this is 0 effect size. Oh, sorry. So this red line represents 0 effect size, and the green lines represent an effect size of 1 and -1. And so this is effect size is plotted against level of intelligence of the participants. And so this is for participants with an IQ of 85. You can see that there's an advantage. So there's a positive effect size for this group, and around an IQ level of 105 and 110, this becomes 0. So for participants with lower levels of intelligence, you can see an advantage in Raven's matrices performance in the autistic group, but if you look at higher ability participants, the group difference disappears, it becomes 0. And these are the results of the meta-analysis. So again, this in the middle, you can see this is 0, and there's quite a wide range of effect sizes. So again, you see some studies which found no difference between the two groups. So the 0 effect size, you can see the confidence intervals across 0 for several studies, and then you also see studies with an effect size of 2, which is quite a huge difference between the two groups. And the average effect size was 0.757, so it was a large difference favoring the typically developing group. So you can see that the results are quite different from the results of the analogy meta-analysis. And then we also found an effect of or a difference between participants with different levels of intelligence. And this was also in the opposite direction to what we found earlier. So you can see here, this is participants with an IQ of 95 or 90-95. There's a big difference between the autistic and non-autistic group, with favoring the typically developing group. And but if you look at higher ability participants with an IQ, a verbal IQ of maybe 115 and above, then group differences basically disappear. So there's no real difference between their performance. Okay, so just to summarize the results of the two meta-analyses. So what we can say overall is that autistic participants have unimpaired analogical reasoning ability. And in fact, if you look at autistic people with lower levels of vector intelligence, they actually show a moderate advantage on Raven's matrices compared to age and IQ matched typically developing people. And on the other hand, there's a disadvantage in autism in metaphor processing, and this has a medium to large effect size, but this was not really present in the case of high verbal ability participants. So this was more evident in the lower ability samples. So you can see that there's a contrast between these results, and so you could probably, based on these results, you could probably assume that autistic participants probably don't rely on analogical reasoning when they try to process metaphors, because then they should probably do better on metaphor tasks. I would just highlight that a lot of publications claim that differences in metaphor processing are not present if you well match participants with autism and typical development on verbal ability. And this is not what we have found. So we only found a lack of group differences in the case of really high verbal ability participants. And also after reviewing this literature, we have found some important gaps in our knowledge. So you notice that we could only found a reasonably small number of studies which were kind of which used a good methodology to really look at differences between the autistic and non-autistic participants. So, for example, we found that verbal analogical reasoning has not really been investigated in autism. There was only a single study that did that. Also, there was no study at all which looked at both analogical reasoning and metaphor processing in a single study in an autistic sample. And also we noticed that these studies typically, especially the studies on analogical reasoning in autism, they don't typically consider reaction times, which is kind of interesting if you think about the lack of group differences. So whether you actually see that there's no difference in the time that they take to process these analogies. Okay, so we conducted a study where we decided to look at analogical reasoning and metaphor processing together, and also we wanted to look at specifically verbal analogical reasoning, and basically try to look at both accuracy and reaction times, and also try to use tasks which are kind of similar to each other in format, so that we can make a better comparison between these two. And we were also quite interested in whether we could find support for the analogy hypothesis of metaphor processing in either the typically developing or the autistic samples. So is there any evidence that maybe analogical reasoning is fundamental or related to metaphor processing? Finally, we also looked at the relations between some typical autism-related cognitive characteristics. So, for example, probably you know that autistic people are characterized by some impairments in social skills, problems with attention switching, and at the same time, they are really strong in attending to details. So this is a typical strength in autism. So this is what I mentioned earlier. And they also have impairments in their communication skills, and usually characterized by restricted interests and restricted imagination. So whether any of these characteristics would be related to their performance on either the analogical reasoning or the metaphor processing task. So the participants in this study were 23 autistic participants and 27 typically developing participants. They were all recruited from university courses, so they were very high functioning. They were matched on age, they were matched on gender, subject of study, so they were recruited from the same university courses. We also matched them on their verbal ability, including vocabulary and also verbal working memory. And we asked both groups to complete the autism quotient scale, which is basically assessing these autistic cognitive characteristics that I described earlier. And all participants had very high verbal ability, so around 100 and a verbal IQ of around 110. And we also included an additional sample of typically developing participants. Maybe you know that a lot of people who are diagnosed with autism are males. So in the matched sample, we only had, or almost just had, male participants. So in this additional group, we had just female participants, and also this group was not as strictly, like not as high ability. So it was a more representative sample of the typical university population. So they were still high ability, but a much broader range, not just people with an IQ above 110. And they were not matched to the autistic group on subject of study. So they were from a more diverse general university background. Okay, so the verbal analogies that we used in the study were based on Green et al.'s materials, and actually this is not correct here. So we used within domain analogies and cross domain analogies. So within domain analogies, when you take both the source and the target from the same domain, so nose is to scent, is like tongue is to taste. Cross domain analogies are like braces to wrist, bracelet is to wrist, is like moat is to castle. So you take the source and the target from different domains, and so the idea is that if you use cross-domain analogies, these are more difficult and they are considered more creative. And so basically, we actually didn't present the analogies in this way as I described them here. So nose is to scent is as tongue is to taste. I think this was the way we presented them. So not exactly like this, or maybe nose is to scent as tongue is to taste. And we also had some false analogies, which were like baker is to cake, is like muffin is to blueberry. So basically, like just some invalid analogies. And the task was to say whether these were correct or analogies or not. And the metaphors that we used, these were based on some classic studies with autistic people, and so they were quite conventional, simple metaphors. So Lewis didn't like the computers at school; they were all dinosaurs. Or the night sky was so clear; the stars were diamonds. So these are quite familiar metaphorical expressions, and we also had some false metaphors administered to the participants. Okay, so these are the results for the analogical reasoning task. So you see the three types of analogies. So cross-domain analogies are the blue bar, within domain analogies are the green bar, and false analogy is this grayish bar. So you see that there was a main effect of analogy type. So as expected, cross-domain analogies were a bit more difficult than within-domain analogies, and false analogies were the most difficult. And what you can also see in the results is that the pattern is very similar to both the autistic and the control group. So it seems that they essentially processed the analogies in a very similar way. And if you look at reaction times, you can see, again, a very similar effect of type of analogy, but you also see that autistic participants were maybe about 1 second slower in processing these analogies. So they take a longer time to process these analogies. And if you look at the metaphor results, there was, so it looks like if you look at the results from the autistic group, it looks like there's a difference between true and false metaphors, but actually, and it looks like a different pattern in the autistic group than in the control group, but actually this was not statistically significant. So basically, accuracy was exactly the same, I mean, statistically exactly the same in both groups. In the case of reaction times, there is actually a statistically significant difference between processing true and false metaphors. So true metaphors were easier to process than false metaphors, but there was no interaction between metaphor type and group, but there was again a main effect of group in the case of reaction time. So again, the control group was faster than the autistic group. And in terms of correlations with measures of verbal ability and autistic traits, in this correlation matrix, you see correlations for the autistic group first, and then in brackets, you see correlations for the control group. And this is the expanded control or typically developing group. So this involves all participants, not just those participants who were matched to the autistic group. And so what you can see, actually a lot of the correlations are non-significant, but something that you can notice that vocabulary skills were moderately related to both analogical reasoning and metaphor processing in the typically developing group. And there was quite a similar pattern in the autistic group, but this was not significant at this sample size. Here you can see a very, very strong correlation between verbal working memory and analogical reasoning in the autistic group. So this is quite, this is a very strong relationship. And again, there's kind of a similar relationship between verbal working memory and metaphor processing in the autistic group, but again, this is not significant. Then attention to detail, so good attention to detail related to analogical reasoning in autism, which I guess it's kind of, I will return to this later, but I think it's kind of interesting if you think about analogical reasoning, where you should focus on not really the details of the entities that you are comparing, but you should focus much more on the relations between those entities. And also there was a correlation between problems with imagination and reaction times on the metaphor task in the autistic group. So basically, those autistic people who had more problems with imagination skills, they were slower in processing the metaphors. And you can see similar correlations with accuracy, actually, both on the analogy and the metaphor task, but these were, again, not significant. Okay, so what about the analogy hypothesis of metaphor processing? In the total, or the expanded typically developing group, we actually found a significant correlation between metaphor processing and analogical reasoning of 0.4, so reasonably substantial correlation. And actually, it was not very dissimilar in the autistic group, and the two correlation coefficients are not statistically different. So although this is not a significant relationship in the autistic group, this is kind of similar to the other group. Okay, so if you think about the results of the correlational analysis that I presented Earlier, you noticed probably that vocabulary scores were related to both analogical reasoning and metaphor processing in the typically developing group, so these correlations were significant, and then there was a kind of a similar trend in the autistic group. So in this mediation analysis, we checked whether vocabulary scores actually mediated the link between analogical reasoning and metaphor processing. And this was actually the case. And in this model, we integrated the results from both groups. So we have all the typically developing participants as well as the autistic participants, and also checked whether any of these links were moderated by group membership, and these links were not significant. So this model applied to both groups. So basically, analogical reasoning performance related to metaphor processing, but this was mediated by vocabulary scores. And we also included working memory scores as covariate in this analysis, and this was a significant covariate. So basically, it looks like the links between analogical reasoning and metaphor processing are really explained by participants' verbal ability, including their vocabulary scores and their verbal working memory skills. Okay, so just to summarize these final results. Okay, so in line with what you could expect based on the meta-analysis results, there was no difference in accuracy in either metaphor processing or analogical reasoning between the autistic and typically developing groups, although we should highlight that these were really high ability participants who were well matched on verbal ability. So I guess these ideas are in line with the general idea that figurative language impairments are not always present in autism. So this kind of this is in line with the changes of diagnostic criteria for autism, which no longer consider figurative language deficits as a core trait in autism or a core symptom of autism. And also these findings extend previous findings with nonverbal analogies in autism. So basically we can say that autistic people are not only good at analogical reasoning with nonverbal materials, but they are also quite good at processing verbal analogies. But we should also note that autistic participants were slower on both tasks. So I guess one possible explanation is that because these are kind of dissimilar tasks. So one possible explanation is that that they just have a general problem with verbal materials, or even more general problems with processing speed. And actually, this is what's described in some studies. So, for example, processing speed issues have been identified in high-functioning autistic people before, and these studies also linked it to problems with verbal fluency and communication skills. So basically what it might mean is that although these people can process both analogies and metaphors when they are in a conversational context, for example, in a real life setting, and they are listening to other people talking, maybe they just need more time to process this information, so they might show a clinically significant deficit in these contexts because they are just too slow to follow a conversation or to process these in conversational contexts. And I think we, in terms of potential differences between the groups, so something which was quite clear was that autistic participants strongly relied on verbal working memory resources when they processed analogical reasoning, which kind of suggests that maybe they were relying some kind of effortful strategy to process these analogies, and they also seem to rely on attention to detail. So it's possible that maybe they use some kind of a different strategy to process verbal analogies. Maybe this is based on a more detailed step-by-step kind of comparing things between source and target and creating links in this more piecemeal manner. So it's possible that they are relying on a different strategy from typically developing people, but then the result is quite similar. So in the end, they come up with a different interpretation and different solution. And also we found this link with imaginations or problem with imagination skills and performance on the metaphor task. So I guess this is not very surprising if you know about the literature on metaphor processing. And also, I guess we should say that these results don't support the analogy hypothesis of metaphor processing, but we should also consider that in this study we had metaphors which were quite conventional and kind of familiar. So maybe if we had more novel metaphors in the study, maybe we would have found more evidence for links between analogical reasoning and metaphor processing. But we were interested in these kinds of metaphors because these were kind of more extensively studied in the analogy or in the autism literature before. And so that was really my final slide. I just wanted to mention that I co-edited this book with Ruth Byrne about thinking, reasoning, and decision-making in autism. And in case, I know probably not many of you are into autism research, but in case you are interested in, for some reason, you are interested in high-level cognition in autism, this is quite a recent publication, so the chapters are kind of still up to date. And also, just to finish with like presenting you with an analogy and metaphor side by side, just to contemplate on any differences or similarities between them. Yeah, and thank you so much for your attention.